Hi, everybody. Welcome to everyone. And I want to thank Jennifer, Milka, and Taylor for organizing our first Black Studies speaker series at Queen's University. And thank you to our panelists for joining us virtually from all sorts of places all over the globe. This is the third iteration of the Black Studies Speaker Series on queer and quare religions. The speaker series was developed alongside the minor in Black Studies, and it's intended to illuminate faculty, staff, and student work in our program and think through how Black studies and Black politics breach university walls. This means, of course, thinking about Black studies as diasporic in method and theory, and also working out how Black studies imagines collective liberation. That is Black and non-Black liberation and freedom through radical relationality. Jennifer Leith's speaker series attends to all of these nuances, gathering brilliant scholars who challenge us to grapple with Black queer and Black quare faith across the diaspora in various and varying disciplines and in differing intellectual landscapes. I'm very excited about the third panel on Black queer and Black quare religions, Black queer Islams. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Catherine, and thank all of you who are joining us today. Islams as ways of submitting to Allah are invoked through this series, sparking our hegemonic and sanctified imaginations in countless ways. We remember the Sunni and Shia branches of the faith alongside the Ahmadiyya and Quare relatives. We acknowledge the gifts of Sufism that transcend these distinctions. We recall the 5 pillars of faith that define well-traveled paths of submission to the divine: profession of faith, shahada, prayer, salat, alms, zakat, fasting, psalm, and pilgrimage, hajj. As there is one God to faithful Muslims, for many there is but one Islam. For people of African descent in diaspora and on the continent, the journey of Islam and perhaps Islams are as intricate, complex, and multiple as a Giri design. Before questions of Sharia and its role, or even jihad, come questions of ummah. How are we community? Who are our people? How has Allah bound us together? Whether something within turned the enslaved to pray toward the face of the rising sun, the direction of Mecca, or the evils of racism directed people of African descent in the United States to the national possibilities of Islam, whether curiosities brew and evidences broil about the role of Islam and Muslim leaders in the transatlantic and Islamic slave trades and colonization, or concerns persist about the roles of women, slavery, racism, and LGBTQ+ people in the faith. Our stories as people of African descent are not whole without reference to Allah and the Blessed Prophet Muhammad. Through today's panel, we have an opportunity to hear from people whose faithful sojourns as people of African descent with respect to Islam and LGBTQ+ identities have been well considered and intentional. This panel has been called together to consider what it means to live in the significances of Blackness, queerness, and Islam. This panel has been called together to teach us more about Islams as personal and institutional religious possibilities. This panel has been called together to remind us of Al-Nisa, the women of the faith, including the women in Red Summer's film and their stories. This panel has been called together to try on and try out the covering of quare or quare, as some may say, Q-U-A-R-E. For some of us, quare is new and or an unfamiliar term. One way to understand quare as we weigh this term in Black queer Islamic context is simply a way of saying queer. As E. Patrick Johnson describes and defines it, quare is from the African-American vernacular for queer, denoting excess, incapable of being contained within conventional categories of being. And so, as we begin, I remind us of part 3 of Johnson's definition of queer, a noun meaning one who thinks and feels and sometimes acts up, committed to struggle against all forms of oppression, racial, sexual, gender, class, religious, etc. Thank you again to Catherine McKittrick, Daniel McNeil, Milka Njorge, Taylor Sanak, Taiwa Khalidu Brahma, Danita Arthurs, Scott Fitzpatrick, Claire Grady Smith, as well as the Religious Coalition of Reproductive Choice and the Black Studies Collective, the Department of Gender Studies and the School of Religion and Cultural Studies at Queen's University, who have all contributed to the success of this series in various ways. I also must acknowledge that we join you from the unceded land of Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Mississaugas of the Credit and Chippewa, and the Wendat people, with the hope that the work we do and the ways we live might manifest presents and futures more just than our pasts. With that, I will present our guests to kick off today's conversation. Red Summer is an educator, hip hop curator, owner of Two Fingers Press and Ready Made Event Studio. She has studied arts education at Grambling State University. She earned master's degrees in interdisciplinary art from Columbia College, Chicago, and heritage preservation museum studies from Georgia State University. Having traveled the world as a spoken word artist, publisher, performer, motivational speaker, and filmmaker, Red Summer curated the opening of the Hip Hop Museum, DC. Some of us were able to enjoy a private virtual screening of Al Nisa, Black Muslim women in Atlanta's gay Mecca last night. Red Summer directed and was featured in this film. We are especially honored that Red Summer and those involved in the film allowed us to share this film with so many of you for this series in what marks the 10th year since the film's release. Asadullah Muhammad is an impact strategist, organizational leader, public media executive, and father, with 20 years of service in public education, nonprofit leadership, restorative justice, and community development. Lali Mohamed is interested in the power and poetics of community-based knowledge. For the last 10 years, he has been the co-lead for Salam Canada, a national volunteer-driven organization that creates and cultivates supportive spaces for LGBTQ Muslims, newcomers, and refugees. And Dr. Amina Wadud is a world-renowned scholar and activist with a focus on Islam, justice, gender, and sexuality. After achieving full professor, she retired from U.S. academia, except as visiting researcher to Starr King School for the Ministry, California, USA. After 15 years in retirement, she has recently returned to academia as visiting professor to the National Islamic University in Jakarta, Indonesia. She migrated to Indonesia in 2018 to avoid the chaos of US politics and ethics firsthand. Author of Quran and Women, and Woman, rereading the sacred text from a woman's perspective, a classic that helped towards the development of epistemology and methodology in Islamic feminism, which is the most dynamic aspect of Islam reform today. It is 3 decades old and translated over 10 times more, most recently into French. Her second manuscript, Inside the Gender Jihad, Women's Reform in Islam, moved the discussion further by aligning it with a mandate for ethics and activism in collaboration with scholarship and spirituality. Her most recent publication is Once in a Lifetime, a memoir of Islamic devotional practices. After completing a 3-year research grant investigating 500 years of Islamic classical discourse on sexual diversity and human dignity, funded by the Arcus Foundation, she is organizing an international center for queer Islamic studies and theology, QIST, the first of its kind in the world. Mother of 5 and Nana to 6, she is best known as the Lady Imam. And it is now to Dr. Amina Wadud, our moderator, that I will turn things over for our conversation and panel tonight. Thank you.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I begin, as I always begin, in the name of Allah, whose grace I seek in this and all other matters. I ask Allah's forgiveness for any errors that I might make through the frailty of being human. It's so exciting to have this opportunity to moderate from our wonderful panel. Many of them are new to me, so I have been doing my research based on what they have shared. And now I will give you an opportunity to listen to them directly. I think we will be starting with Red Summer, please.
Greetings, everyone. First, I just want to thank everyone for allowing me to be here. I'll admit that I had not heard of queer before this invitation, and I believe that being separated from academia for so long takes you away from being intimately connected to evolving terminologies as they are developing and the conversations that can be so beautiful around those evolving terminologies. And so I had to look it up and I was interested in the ways that the queer presence allows for intersectionality that includes Blackness. And it made me think of ways that Alnisa highlighted some of those ways that I am both marginalized and privileged. When we made the film, we were very clear that we were the only ones who could make that film at that time. Being Black and woman and queer in America was already sort of a triple threat in marginalization as it would be. However, as I discussed the topics that were brought up in the film with our Middle Eastern sisters and women who were around the world, we were also made aware that we were in a unique position of privilege being Black Americans. And because many of us were first or second generation Muslims in our family, we took the position of safety that granted us very seriously. And we use that as an opportunity to bring light to a conversation where there was no public light at that time. So for one of our early interviewees, she mentioned that that there were very serious safety issues that would come from speaking on a documentary of that form if it were to leave the school setting. And so that was something that we took very, very seriously. So when we made the film, there was one organization that we had access to that spoke to the queer Muslim experience. And that organization was called Al-Fatiha. And I was only able to attend one meeting before they disbanded, but that meeting did spark a desire in me to have a community of some form. And I had not previously imagined that there could or would be a community around queerness and Muslimness. And 10 years later, I'm sure there are multiple spaces in person and online for people to gather with these particular identities. But it also cannot go without saying that the Black women who were participating in this project 10 years ago, who were converts to Islam and were attending meetings like Al-Fatiha, were being left out of conversations because when people wanted to exclude them, they would just start speaking Arabic. And so even in a beloved community for queer Muslims, there was a presence of anti-Blackness that was indisputable. And so what you see in that documentary is a response to the queer experience without even knowing that we were doing just that, that being queer and Muslim were not enough to validate our acceptance into the community because we were Black and therefore we were othered.
Thank you for your sharing, Asadullah.
Thank you. Greetings, everyone. It's an honor to be in this space with you all. I've been knowing about your work for a while. Dr. Wadud, my ex-wife actually went to your prayer in the early aughts in New York City. But I really appreciate this conversation. Being Black, queer, and Muslim can feel very isolating. And I remember Googling Black gay Muslim in, I don't know, 2000, 2001, and nothing really came up. And I said, I'm not going to be the first one. So what I learned is that I wasn't the first Black queer Muslim, and that there's so many of us out here. But myself being raised in a Jamaican family in New York City, a very international city where Islam was all around me, but I grew up Presbyterian, and my church was more like a community center, which I appreciated and kept me busy and gave me a great social life and some mentors. But I was really looking for a spiritual home, and when I had some people in my community go to the Million Man March, they came back and started a committee in Queens, and that allowed me to get closer to learning about Islam. And I eventually took my Shahada and identified as a Sunni Muslim. But along that journey, I did not think that I could be gay or attracted to men in Islam, and thought that Muslim spaces would make me straight and make me other than what felt natural to me. So I did actually fall in love with a woman and I have three beautiful children who are all teenagers now. And later in my marriage is when I actually decided to be honest with myself and my wife at the time, and what felt like rip my life apart and undo all of these safety nets and community relationships that I had in Brooklyn, New York, and just trying to be a quote unquote good Black man is something I heard often growing up. And all the good Black men, from El-Hajj Malik Shabazz to Marcus Garvey to Bob Marley, they all seemed to be men who were with women, until I read up more about El-Hajj Malik Shabazz, Malcolm X, and some of his experiences. But what gave me the courage to be my full self was reading George Jackson, who was a political prisoner, mentor to Huey Newton, who founded the Black Panther Party for self-defense. And in his book, Soledad Brother, George Jackson said things as in letters to his father about most of us will live in half-butchered lives as we are fighting for Black liberation, and also that men were born free, but everywhere he's in chains. And that really resonated with me and made me think about the kind of life I wanted to live. And if I have 3 children and one of them are queer, would I be putting the burden on them to see if they have the courage to be their full self if they didn't know where their father stood on supporting people being whoever they desire to be, and however they naturally feel to show up in the world. So yeah, I think queer, the word queer, with E. Patrick Johnson, who also made this incredible documentary, Making Sweet Tea, that really resonated with me as someone from New York City, but who now lives in North Carolina. I think that we always have to find our own way. Many times as Black people, we can't just not a copy and paste kind of traditions. We want to make things feel right for us and put our own cultural stamps on it, make it go to our own rhythm. We remix, we reimagine, and I think being a Black queer Muslim, a lot of those principles is something that we have to manifest in our own lives, of reimagining how we can show up in the world and reimagining who we will be. And as a first generation Muslim in a Jamaican family, seeing Black Muslim and father and queer, words that don't go together. I think the experience of being a Black person allows you to, or allowed me, gave me the courage to show up as my authentic self, and still on that journey, and it feels good, and it's beautiful to see conversations like this happening in the world. So that's a little bit of my reflections on the word queer, and yeah, I'll pass it back. Thank you.
Thank you, Asadullah. Lali, can you share with us?
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. I'd like to first begin by saying thank you to Queen's University, to Jen and to Catherine for inviting me here today. And I'd also like to just praise this virtual space of ours. I'd like to praise the struggle of, and the struggle with, and the struggle to overcome the constant homophobia, the transphobia, the xenophobia, the Islamophobia, the anti-Black racism, the violent and vile misogyny, the ableism, the shame and stigma of HIV that is directed at so many of our communities. I want to praise that, and this struggle. There are constant internal revolutions, I feel, that constantly tell us that we are not only worthy of great love, but that we are the source of great love. And so I want to praise every single moment of resilience and resistance that make us so supernatural. Because it's very much supernatural that in the face of all of this, our people, we continue to create, we continue to build, we continue to love, we continue to sustain, and we continue to show up and show out. I also want to thank everybody at home today watching us, to my friends, to my lovers, to Boston's queer Muslim community. I know you have gathered tonight to watch out, to shout out to all of you guys at home. In thinking about this invitation, I have been thinking about Audre Lorde, mother, poet, sister, particularly their poem, A Litany for Survival. One, they write, for those of us who live on the shoreline, my first queer memory begins on a shoreline, a small peninsula in the Horn of Africa, a country that has been washed by the Gulf of Aden and has a rather long and violent history with European invaders. I'm talking about Somalia. It's a country considered a land of poets. My mother was born there. Her family, because of war, is now dispersed throughout the world. Germany, Abu Dhabi, Djibouti, Copenhagen, the UK, Italy. I say this and I begin here because the work of naming ourselves, I think, is so crucial. My mother is a Black Muslim woman. My mother's mother is a Black Muslim woman. My mother's mother's mother is a Black Muslim woman. And the whole system wakes up every single day trying to exterminate her body, her spirit. My mother's very survival on that shoreline is queer. 2, for those of us who live on the shoreline, standing upon the constant edges of decision, crucial and alone. I return to that shoreline, that imagined memory often in my life, because my mother's life, I believe, is full of ethical innovation. What she did in so many ways, like so many of the Black Muslim women I know, was create a completely different political, social, economic life for herself and for her children. A new way of being in this world that was premised on her othering and that contained the conditions for a better future. Or, in what E. Patrick Johnson's words, she lived out the excess, incapable of being contained within conventional categories. That's pretty queer to me. 3, for those of us who live on the shoreline, standing upon the constant edges of decision, crucial and alone. For those of us who cannot indulge the passing dreams of choice. Growing up, I don't think I ever had use for the word queer. I do not have the pleasure of indulging in it. I was always already queer. Queer could never capture, let alone encapsulate, the kitchen tables, the basketball courts, the prayer rooms of my childhood. It was constantly disorienting being Black in a white school that referred to me as a nigger, and in my Muslim community as abed. Both of these communities, it felt like were so intent on telling Black children that they did not belong. In so many ways, queer broke open new futures to me, introduced me to a theory of the flesh, coming out of the Chicana feminist movements in the 60s. The theory recognizes how the physical realities of someone's life, the skin we lather with cocoa butter, the land our grandparents harvested, the sexual longings we've struggled to embrace, how all of this and more fuse to create a politic born out of necessity. And in so many ways, queerness has opened me up to communities and to ideas that have checked and shaped and expanded and deepened my ideas of a deen and a spirituality that focuses and honors the multiplicity of our lives. And I have to admit, I'm so in love with Black queer Muslims. I'm in love with how we imagine, how we birth communities, how we feed and take care of one another, how we hold each other's hands when we visit hospitals or take a walk or go to the club, how we shape worlds with our creativity and our tenacity, and how we have such illuminating conversations like tonight on Beyonce's internet. But I'm especially in love, though, with how so many of us have this incredibly critical posture towards the world. That there is this incredible commitment to use our spirituality in a transformative way, in a way that will reconfigure and remake how we interact with the world. And I think in the age of neoliberalism, of such vicious and unbearable continued violence, I think often how feminist interpretations of Islam, interpretations like Dr. Wadud's, compel us to leap forward and contemplate new ways of being, like my mother did. A counter-hegemonic vision of how to be in this world. And in an age that thrives on extinguishing, on choking the compassion out of all of us, how can our deen, our quare sensibilities and spiritualities reteach us how to show up and love one another? And I hope over the next sort of 30 minutes today that we can continue this conversation, and I look forward to it.
Thank you all for your sharing, also for your being. I would like to, just before I bring it back to the panel, I would like to set the landscape because our audience might be from varied locations. Try to keep in mind, I think that each of us belong to many intersecting circles of being. Sometimes an aspect is contested in one of those circles, which at the same time will find affirmation in another of those circles. So for quare, which is also a new word for me, thank you, Red Summer, for saying that. For quare, we have to kind of hone in on what are all the specifics. And I think that's what Asadullah, Red Summer, and Lali bring to us in such a way that we understand there are certain principles about our being that are highlighted even as we interact in those different circles. At the same time, I want us to remember that however queer it may be, there is a sense of belonging to each of those circles. In particular, here with us today is a conversation that reminds us of our identities. In that regard, let me just also identify myself. I identify as a Black woman, as a Muslim, as queer, non-binary. I also think that it's important that I claim my new location as an elder, since I just had my 70th birthday. I add to that the specifications of being cisgender, bisexual, and involuntarily celibate. Now, the reason why I include all of these is because I find that over the 50 years that I have been Muslim by choice, 50 years where I have participated in the discourses of how we even construct what is Islam, I never find a place where all of those identities are at home. However, I continue to support and participate in each of those circles in the ways that I can find the kind of nurturing and a sort of a growing spirit that Lali presented to us. So this is the thing that I want us to remember. In our multiple identities, we will struggle to find that thing called community. In Islamic discourses, the word community comes from the word ummah, and ummah actually comes from the word that means the womb, the thing that both protects us and nurtures us until we are dispelled into the world at large. But once we are dispelled into the world at large, that's when we have to make meaning. And an important aspect of meaning making is community, particularly in the context of Islam. And this is one reason why some of the dominant discourse in the West with regard to queer identity can be a little bit at odds with how it is that we search and try to maintain and participate in keeping that meaning. In the last 10, 20 years, queer Islam has evolved to a place where it now represents a challenge to the dominant heterosexual, patriarchal, hegemonic, binary discourses that still dominates Islam and Muslim communities. But one of the things that my assistant just posted a post because she does this periodically, in which I say that queer Muslims are not waiting for permission from that dominant community. We have formed our own sacred spaces. These spaces in some ways were a benefit of the coronavirus, because we have learned that space is not just physical. The space can also be virtual. We have formed our own sacred spaces. Some of these spaces are temporary. One Muslim I know wrote a dissertation in which she talked about, Islam in a box. And, sometimes you have to move that box around in order to be able to do your sacred gathering. It's important to continue to do those sacred gatherings because there is nurturance. Remember, the concept of ummah also includes the idea of nurturance. There is nurturance in being in community. And yet, as quare, it is particularly important that we also claim those parts of us that are loggerheads even in those spaces. Nevertheless, I think queer Muslims have offered the first alternative sacred spaces that are, the word inclusive is the one that comes to mind. They're inclusive. And if they are not equally inclusive of all who want to attend, they are astute to being checked for that. So the existence of Black racism in the context of Islam in America, obviously there cannot be anti-Blackness when there are also queer communities in Africa, but in the context of America, it still becomes a factor when those queer spaces are dominated by brown and yellow and white peoples. So again, they have to be checked with regard to that. And that becomes our responsibility. In other words, we have to learn to enhance the awareness of those spaces that at least help us to reconcile different aspects about our identity. And in that way, before I, ask you each, separately questions with regard to this, or, help ask you to invoke some comments with regard to, all of this. In that way, I think it is important to embrace the fact that we are members of multiple communities, and to whatever extent it is we are able to self-represent, we are leaving a legacy. In watching the film An-Nisa, for example, many of the interviewees expressed how difficult it was for them not finding a mirror that would reflect back to them, these are my own words, that would reflect back to them what was their realities. In this generation, we are the most transformative generation with regard to queer identity in all of the 1500 years of Islam. It sounds like a boast, but the reality is, when I said we are not waiting for permission in order to be in the context of, Islam and in the context of what is Muslim worship and Muslim identity, we are not waiting for permission, because the hegemonic kind of Islam is the kind of Islam that tells you have to have a leader, and that leader is the one who tells you how to be. Well, what happens if that leader is the one that is pushing back to your affirmation of all aspects of your identity? So that's why self-representation is so important. It's important for us to leave little breadcrumbs until we have the gingerbread house, which hopefully is not inhabited by a negative witch that will try to eat us. But the point is, we have to learn to give to our communities in such a way that those communities are broadened, so that the notion of inclusive does in fact include us. We have to participate in those spaces fully within our own skin. And that allows for those spaces to be pushed towards greater inclusion of all the different intersecting circles that we belong to. So with that in mind, I want to start with Asadullah. In your sharing, both in terms of what you had written and what you say here, you express in terms of self-representation, so you can correct me if I'm misunderstanding it, you express that your identity was something that was developing. And I would like for you to speak with us about how you develop an identity in the context of that sometimes pushback.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I could listen to you, Lady Imam, all day. Wow, what you just shared was so powerful. Yeah, I believe in constantly evolving and constant growth. I think because there's no roadmap in being Black, queer, and Muslim, we don't have, widely spread stories about how we are to show up in the world. It is a bit of a, making a masterpiece of all of these different pieces of life and of ourselves. And as a parent, honestly, I've experienced parent alienation from my queerness. I've been told that I'm not supposed to, that I'm the devil, that I'm not supposed to just exist or be, right? Very hateful, hard things. And once the liberation I felt in the way that I feel like I was charting new ground for, especially for my children and generations to come within my own lineage, to say, yes, we were here and I'm gonna do it so you don't have to go through struggles that I went through. Having a Jamaican family where homophobia was in songs at birthday parties, right? That the whole family was dancing to, and thinking that you would lose your whole family. But I even had to check what I thought about my own culture and the people that I came from, because when my father learned about my queerness, and I was, started practicing Islam, and then, well, I started being queer, yeah, real early on, but I wasn't out at the time. But my father said something really profound. He said to me at the time, he said, if you like men like I like women, I know you couldn't fight it. And to me, like, for him to put himself in my shoes and also just think about science, biology. I mean, we also have the same birthday, and but he was one that called me, a Bati boy, and when I cried one time, and this man also had the space in him to say, I love you, and it makes sense that you have to be your full self. And I think developing in ways that if I'm asking or thinking that other people should stretch, that I'm constantly stretching myself too, and taking off layers and giving people an opportunity to grow and ask questions. But yeah, those are some ways that I'm developing and reading and getting out of my own head and taking care of my mental health and my body. And so all those things are important to me.
Yes, thank you. One of the reasons why I began the conversation with Jennifer was because in the context of the liberal West, one of the features that seemed to be a requirement is that you be out. And I want to talk about it for a second before I just ask again for the others to share. When we have these intersecting circles of our identity, it is true that we also receive nurturing from those circles in different ways. And sometimes being out, as LGBTQI, will cause a rift between us and a kind of central communal nurturing, because, for example, the generation that is before us, that would be your parents, even though I know there's a little bit of age disparity there, but the generation that is before us consists of people who have nurtured us. I think Asadullah talked about, the Black Jamaican women that are, such an important part of his heritage. But where do they go when they want to seek information and at the same time affirmation, if they want to continue to love and embrace, and therefore support the growth of their child? Sometimes you think of what they call the old uncles who go to the mosque. That mosque, the sort of dominant mosque model, that mosque does not provide nurturing for the queer and quare identity. How is it going to, bring some assistance to the parents of that identity? So the parents must either choose sometimes to separate themselves from someplace where they have had nurturance, or we have to rethink whether or not being out is as essential. I mean, I know older queer Muslims, who have never come out to their parents, and their parents pass away and they've never come out because of the love that they have for their parents and the love that their parents have for them. I mean, it's not as if they have not seen, the aspects of, queer identity are infused in a lot of ways. So it's not that they haven't seen it. For example, she or they never married in the typical, binary way of it. And so they have seen certain manifestations of it, but they don't name it. And that is because sometimes being out is an antagonism to places where we receive a lot of nurturing. And I think that that's really important because we are balancing between what the liberal Western articulation of queer identity is and what we literally face in terms of queer identities. So, I kind of wanted to put that out there. Red Summer, my sister, actually, you're my niece. People in your age get to call me auntie. You're so welcome. You're so important to this gathering. I just have to say that because actually in my 20 years of active engagement with queer Muslims globally, it is still very highly represented by the men. So it's really important for you to share with us a little bit more about your experiences, particularly as a cisgendered woman who is at the same time Black and Muslim and active in the community.
Yes, thank you so much. I wanted to say before we get started about a connection that we have. I received an email and I didn't know if I should respond to it. I didn't really know what it was. It was from Star King, and they were offering me an honorary doctorate for Al-Nisa. And Dr. Farah JJ had recommended me for this honor, but had passed away before I was given the honor. And so when I went to the school to accept the doctorate degree, so many people had an opportunity to talk to me about why I was selected for that, but I didn't get a chance to talk to anyone about the why and the how and the discussions behind it. So I'm really excited to speak to someone else who has a connection to the school. And I will also say I was very happy that when you were speaking, I was not on camera because I definitely did an ugly cry back here when you spoke about, because I remember a poem from many years ago, and I'm not pulling up the poet, but it was about being invited to a party and all of you got the invitation, right? Every part of you was invited to the party and you didn't have to leave anything behind. And when I have the opportunity to be in these spaces, I am so full because I do forget what it's like to be able to talk about all of it and share all of it and not have to leave bits and pieces out because I don't think people will understand me contextually. And so I'm, just filled again with gratitude to be in this space and to share the panel with all of you. Again, I also wanted to kind of touch on what you said a minute ago. I remember when we did a screening in North Carolina somewhere, it might have been at Duke. And I had spoken on NPR earlier in the day, and then we went and did the screening. And there were 4 elder women who were sitting on the front row in the screening. And I was so excited to see them and, just really happy and smiling. And they stood up and they told me about myself. And they were, getting me together and admonishing that I would even come there and attach homosexuality to Islam and why that was wrong. And they were telling me what they came there to tell me. And the audience that was mostly white women started to stand up and give me like a standing ovation, like a round of applause to drown them out. And I had to, like, watching this happen, put myself in the position of saying, first of all, thank you. Like, I see what you're doing and I appreciate you advocating for me, but these are my aunties and you need to let them speak, right? And it was such a turning point for me because, one, I had been buffered from a lot of those conversations. I think I was telling Jennifer earlier that one of our great allies for the film is our editor, who posted the trailer on YouTube. And she received the brunt of the feedback, as it would be, from the film. And she was so gracious and so kind, and she would delete things that she knew that she didn't ever want us to see. And she would respond to the people, in kind of cheeky ways that she would want to, well, thank you for watching, well, I appreciate your opinion, and that kind of thing. But I, until that point, had been buffered from the conversation. And I wanted to have it. And I wanted to have it with my aunties in a way that we could share both sides of it and feel whole at the end of the conversation. Because a lot of times we are receiving this criticism not from a place that intends to be demeaning. It feels like love, right? When our family members are trying to tell us, what we should be doing and how we should do it. But the progression of what love looks like and feels like only happens through having those conversations and getting through the hard part and getting to, like Asadullah said, like with his father, being able to say, okay, like I said all the other stuff and now, now I'm here, like all I'm left with is understanding. My mother and I didn't speak for at least a year. Didn't say a word, went from talking all the time, didn't speak for at least a year. And it wasn't until You People was being screened in Chicago, and she came to the screening and saw what that silence was doing to me at the time, that she was able to get past her punishment and get to some sense of normalcy and some sense of love and support in a way that was nurturing for both of us. And so, now she comes and spends months at the house with my wife and I, and, she's, super excited and wants to come and be with us in her elderhood and all of that. And so it is something that is difficult to start with, but once we get through those difficult conversations, we can get to some balance.
I would love
Well,
to jump in, Amina,
oh,
if that's okay.
yeah, jump on it.
I think it's really beautiful and like powerful and transformational when like hard conversations, right, lead to a place of like understanding and lead to a place of love and connection and depth. But the reality, at least here in Canada, is that that's not always the case, right? You know, in literally in communities across the country, from coast to coast to coast, there are queer, trans, and questioning kids coming out because they're seen as antagonistic, right? Their beings are seen as antagonistic, and they're being kicked out of their homes, and they end up homeless and in shelters and sometimes dead. Or they're being given one-way tickets back home and you never see them again. And so I'm really grateful that there are some queer kids who don't, you know, have the luxury of a closet, right? You know, like some of us just come out and we are we are out and we don't have the luxury, right, of like hiding in shadows or in the corners of mosques because of our gender identities, and experience such vile violence because of our identities. And so sometimes it's okay for the aunties not to actually speak, because so much, right? Like if Whitney Houston said the children are the future, and I believe anything Whitney says, right? Like how can we create communities that actually don't create space for like hate? You know, because if my identity is being seen and read immediately as antagonistic, right? It is not the responsibility of the child to provide support to the parent. Like it's like that responsibility is not on the child, you know? But there's no room in my life for violence, homophobia, transphobia, you know, and sometimes that means you have to separate yourself. Very briefly, you know, one of my favorite writers is this Black gay man who, in the introduction of a really powerful book called Brother to Brother, he writes, mask maker, make me a mask. And he says, if I had read the book In the Life by Joseph Bean, one of the first Black gay anthologies, he said, if I had read that book, maybe I wouldn't have spent half my life building a mask and the next half of my life trying to find ways to take it off. And so what would it mean to imagine a world where like queer, questioning Black Muslim kids can just like live out their lives? Maybe not come out, right? But at least are supported in ways where they can come into themselves, free from violence, free from fear, free from shame. That's the kind of world that I would love for us to imagine, right? Because I'm just so deeply concerned about all of these. In Toronto, 40% of the people who are living out on the street are queer young people. 40% are queer young people, the majority of them racialized. And any random day I decide to walk out, these kids are Somali, they're from Kenya, they're from Djibouti, you know, and these are my people, and they're being kicked out from Muslim households because they are seen as antagonistic, they are seen as sinful, they are seen as not belonging, you know, and it's just so, it's so heartbreaking, and you know, figuring out ways to not keep them in homes where they are experiencing violence, but finding ways where they can, you know, like have access to love, have access to care, and most importantly, have access to safety, both spiritually, but also physically and emotionally.
That's so important. It's interesting because I had jotted a note about how it is that sometimes we are the teachers of our elders, and that we teach through love. I know sometimes it may sound a little bit idealistic, but I have, in my old age, come to greater and greater appreciations of how it is that we maintain our locations, but we maintain it with dignity despite pushback, and at the same time that we maintain it with love. And I wanted to ask Lali about your location with regard to the conflict that sometimes occurs between Islamophobia and homophobia, or all forms of queerphobia, transphobia, and the like. How do you see these two things in conversation or in conflict with each other?
Oh, they're definitely not in conflict. I think they complement one another. It's like, Toronto is like a beautiful, quote unquote, diverse city. But, I remember like, I got engaged the same night as what occurred in Orlando at the Pulse nightclub. And the next day, somebody had the creativity, the audacity, and the shamelessness to create and make and wear a shirt that said, Muslims really want to kill us. Flagrantly walking in the village. And I was with my friend and uncle and mentor, Al-Farouk Kaki, and we were just like shocked that this man could walk up several blocks in downtown Toronto with nobody saying a word to him. And we, of course, didn't say a word to him because we were just like in shock, right? And so like Islamophobia and scholar Delise Mugabu talks about anti-Black Islamophobia, like manifests itself every single day in my life. Through the shock that I identify as Muslim, through comments about, like my homophobic communities. And at the same time, there is like homophobia from my own communities, right? Like I'm thinking specifically about like Black Muslim communities. And I always remind myself that the people who hold me down and love up on me the hardest are Black Muslims, right? And at the same time, right, the places where I experience most sort of homophobia are also from Black Muslims. And so I'm never, and that multiplicity is important for me to hold, right? Because as you mentioned, Dr. Wadud, like so much of the love and safety and care that we receive for the majority of the first phase of our lives are from our families. And when you lose that, right, it can be devastating. And I remember attending a Al-Fatiha convening in Philadelphia at a Quakers retreat many years ago and experienced many of the things you mentioned, which was very disappointing. But, I remember feeling one night as if I went through a shahada. I grew up Muslim, I was born Muslim, but it was clear to me that after I left home, in many ways, I also left Islam. And it was in 2013 when I was surrounded by all of these queer Muslims that I was like, actually, it was my spirituality and my deen that allowed me to survive, right? That allowed me to keep on going and carve out this beautiful life of mine that I have now. And it was that like faith in Allah, right, that allowed me to do that. But for lots of young people, I think when their parents kick them out, particularly when they're Muslim, and kick them out because of their interpretation of Islam, they also leave the religion. And I once asked a imam, I was like, would you rather push these young people away from the religion or embrace them and bring them closer, And they were like, well, we have no room for them. And at that point, right, it became really important for me to seek out spaces where queer Muslims were like celebrated. And like, thank God, thank goodness, across the US and in places in Europe and in Canada, there are these like Al-Tahweed Jummah circles, you know, that meet, that celebrate the full diversity and plurality of our communities, free from Islamophobia, but also free from homophobia, you know. And I think, you know, like seeking out those spaces is the best thing that we can do. And because we live on Beyonce's internet, you know, it's I always encourage people to like seek out things on the internet, because finding, you know, spaces where you can access all of these things is so crucial, because you like deserve it and you are worthy of love and care and living out your life free from these isms.
Yes, I think, you know, not only seeking them out, but, you know, as Red Summer has done, you know, in her own way, creating those spaces. You all know that I have a very long history in terms of both scholarship and activism for reform in Islam, but I never belonged to a group until I came to Malaysia for my first university post at the International Islamic University there. And I started meeting with what turned out to be 8 women. And we organized what is now more than 30-year-old organization called Sisters in Islam. And then Sisters in Islam became the catalyst for creating a global network called Musawa, or Equality in Muslim Family Law. And I remind people, you know, in my ongoing work for both of these 2 organizations and many others, I remind people that it doesn't take, you know, 100, you know, 1,000 people. You can start something very small and sort of rely upon the voluntary dedication of, you know, those individuals to help formulate the creation of, that's redundant, to help create spaces and opportunities for people to have authentic and transparent self-representation. But you brought up something, and actually others have brought this up. I think Asadullah, I think you started it. But you know, we each have experienced it in different ways. And that is to talk plainly just for a second about some of the hardships, particularly in terms of what in some ways we want to consider our intimate community, our families, etc. To talk about some of the ways of being pushed back with the dominant construct of Islam. I mean, one of the aspects of my work that I feel has been really important is coming to understand that there are Islams. And then when people say, you know, you are not Islam for this kind of interpretation, I say, I'm absolutely not that kind of Islam. You know, I am not that kind of Islam. And I can say so with love and with pride, because I have experienced multiple kinds of articulations of the construct of Islam. And I've also helped to transform our understanding that, you know, Islam is in the mouth of the person who speaks it. And sometimes people speak Islam with hate. And I'm not a part of that community. I don't want to be a part of that community. So I think it's important for us to claim, you know, our own Islam, even though it looks like for certain, especially youth under this kind of duress, you know, that Lali was so aptly describing, it looks like we leave Islam, but we're not leaving Islam. We're leaving hate mongers who happen to be Muslim. And maybe Asadullah, you can talk a little bit about what you might have experienced along those lines.
Yes. I think with the it was complex because I was introduced to Islam through the Nation of Islam that was most accessible to me at the time growing up. You know, being a teenager in 1995, but also I married a woman whose father was a minister in the Nation of Islam. And by the time we met, I wasn't I was not into a lot of the theology of the nation, and kind of grew out of some of the beliefs there. And there was a lot of, at one point, I do think I felt like Islam would make me, it was so much discipline involved, and I would have so much fear in showing up as myself that it would like kind of crush me into this mold of a righteous Muslim man. And I didn't think queer and righteousness could coexist. So there was a lot of unlearning I had to do. And I feel like I experienced a lot of hate when I did what a lot of people said to do, right? Why didn't you just tell the truth? Why couldn't you be honest? Why did you marry a woman? You could have just said you were gay, it's just so easy, just say it. And then when I said, okay, yeah, this is the set I'm claiming of being a Black queer Muslim, then it was like, wait, whoa, we don't hold up, we don't have space for that. And we don't care about you being truthful or honest. Like now we're coming for you. And it was very much, my ex-partner thought that I should ask for permission to introduce my children to my queer friends, or bring them into queer spaces. It was very concerning for me not to have not to come out to teenagers or have my children think one thing. And so I kept asking their mom, can I tell them now? Can I, asking for permission, because they primarily lived with her. And she said, no, when did you learn about sex? You weren't this age, and no, it's too much. And then all of a sudden I picked them up from school one day, and it happened to be, they went to a school named after activists. And they, instead of having Halloween, they kind of dressed up as ancestors. It was the Grace Lee Boggs School. And they went, I picked them up one day, and it was dressed up as your ancestor or an elder. And one of my sons was Mumia Abu Jamal. And then my other son was Elijah Muhammad. And on this particular day, they're not speaking to me. It's supposed to be a celebration. They're not talking. I'm like, what's going on? What's happening? And my oldest son is like, Mom told me about you. And he's like 9. And he's like, Mom told us about you. I said, what do you mean? Well, I kind of immediately knew what he meant. And I was just blindsided and was like, okay, let's talk about it. So I went to the store, bought a Frisbee, took him to a park, and we had the conversation. And I said, if one of your friends like chocolate ice cream and you like vanilla, are you going to be mad at them for liking chocolate ice cream? And they were like, of course not. And I kind of told them that, about the fear of showing up as authentically myself, growing up in a Jamaican family and hearing a lot of hateful things about queer people. And I taught them about how I've always taught them to love everyone, and to think about and not say hateful things when they saw people kiss. Some of it was just their children, they saw people kiss and they're like, ill. But some of it was they saw 2 men and they were like, ill. So I'm like, we're not going to say ill when we see that. And this is actually, who your father is. And yes, I was also teaching them that they were born out of love. Like, I don't consider myself bisexual, but I had bisexual experiences. And at the time, I was truly in love. It was my first time experiencing the feelings of love. And it was very important for me to tell them that they were born out of love, for them to know that. And I think amongst the hate, looking for the light, looking for the love, and being able to pull that out is super important. So for me, it's that journey with my children is still happening. I think parent alienation happened because it's always convenient to go back to, he's queer, he's trying to make them queer, or whatever is being said. I don't even know what's being said, other than they were told they could take a break from me. And for an indefinite amount of time, and the court system isn't helping, and I'm concerned about their mental health. So I had to prioritize, letting them know that they're loved, and when they're ready, I'm ready. So we are definitely still in communication, but as I've partnered in my life and have a partner, it seemed like it was taking my children away. And that is also, it's just complex to build family and be a Black queer Muslim when you are co-parenting. It's hard, but I feel like I have no regrets. So I feel like I've gotten to a level of freedom that I didn't think I would experience in this lifetime. So I'm forever grateful.
Thank you all. I keep my eye on the clock as best I can because it's really tiny. You know, I have these big glasses on. And I know that you will have more to share. Why don't we start entertaining some of the questions from the participants? I already have a couple in the chat. I will ask you all to feel free to chime in with regard to these questions rather than to designate people, because that's always hard. You're all so equally welcome. It's like, how do you do it? With regard to the chat, I just want to remind people of my standard policy, and that is that if you are comfortable with being fully identified, you can include that in the chat. But if on the other hand, you wish to maintain a certain level of discretion and safety for yourself, you can mention that in the chat and I won't, call out your name. So, this is just something that I want to say before I read the ones that I have. Amira Craig wants to ask, do you folks see any parallels between being a revert and coming out, in quotations? Could there be some wisdom from that experience that can be shared with our cishet Muslim loved ones? And by that, she means those who were born into Islam. So that's an exclusive question for those who have come into Islam from someplace else. Asadullah and Red Summer, that means you guys. If not you, in your generation before you, so I just want to make that clear.
Yeah, so I was raised in Islam. My father converted in the 70s. And how my parents met actually was because of Lali Mohamed. My mother was a radio personality who would read Muhammad Speaks on the radio. And so my father was like, I must meet this woman. And so it was interesting for me to come into a queer identity, one, because I was not aware even that women could be gay until I was in college. There was no place for that information to reside in my body, right? But it was also interesting because I spent the majority of my time around women, right? And so I had been primarily in single gendered spaces the majority of my life. And then I get to college and I meet a lesbian, and we were getting ready to go to the Million Woman March. And I'm going, definitely, I want to see all the speakers. We had raised money and got a bus. We were so excited. And there was a girl that was on the bus and nobody wanted to they were fine sitting with her. But the big thing was when we got to Philly, we were going to the Y and we were going to shower and nobody wanted to shower with her there. And I knew immediately that you all are trash people. I'm sure she can hear you, and I'm sure she's not looking at you like in that way, right? And so all of my fight the powerish, right? All of my advocacy, comes out in defense of what I understood as like an underdog in this space where we were supposed to be Black women who were supporting each other and going to this powerful event. And how could you separate her and then go and pretend to be right for the community and for Black women, right? And she became one of my very, very close friends. Of course, we were never partnered, but it was the first person that I was like, oh, wow, like I didn't know that that was possible, because I didn't have language for it or any imagery to support that, right? It wasn't until years later when like I met my first girlfriend who, funny enough, like we dated for a year before I knew that we were girlfriends, that I was able to say like, wow, like I believe this is who I have always been. I just never had an identity to associate with it, right? And then I'm starting to play back like all the stuff that happened in life. I was like, oh, I missed that. I totally missed the signal, right? But yeah, so it is interesting for me because I wasn't asked to leave Islam, and I have not. Like Islam is still very much a part of, it's intricately woven in my identity, in my body and my mind. Just the practice of it, the ritual of Islam is very much connected to who I am in my core. I do also understand that not being able to participate in the communal experience of Islam to the degree that I had growing up also resonates very deeply within me. And so even like coming on to the panel today and just having an opportunity to look at the names here, right? My name is Lali Mohamed. My father asked me not to use my name when I'm speaking to people who know that I'm gay. And so in wanting to honor that relationship with him and say, okay, daddy, all right, like we can find another name. It's not a problem. But it has also been a part of the give and take for us, right? We could still very much be in a separated relationship, but for me, and this is not in any way to say that anyone else has to do this, but I needed to fight to make sure that I still had space in my family, because I also raised 6 teenagers who have been put out of their homes, right? And so I was very aware of how definite that could be, right? And only 2 of the 6 of the children that I've raised who were not my biological children have any real relationship with their parents today, right? And so I knew for me that was something that was important. And I'm also confronting in this conversation that being in communal space, in praise and in prayer is also something that I need to fight for as well.
Yeah, we're still making these spaces so that we can, as you say, be whole. Anonymous attendee asked, especially in the UK and Canada, where there isn't necessarily a distinct Black culture, there may be some internalized anti-Black racism. For example, some East African Muslims being discriminatory towards Black Muslims from the Caribbean. How can we begin to engage in these discussions to begin healing and encouraging safety?
As the Canadian, no. That's a great question. I would like to just gently push back on the idea that Canada doesn't have a Black identity. Black people have been in the Americas, including Canada, since the 17th century. Like in the US, Black people who have landed here in Canada came from the continent through chattel slavery. And we are out here living and loving, carving out communities and communing. We here long time. So I would just like to push back on that idea. In terms of the East African / Caribbean problem, it's a constant conversation, and I would love to, land in a place where we can embrace our differences, where we don't, differences amongst, the continent versus the islands, but also the differences among those of us who were born into Islam and those of us who reverted to Islam, right? Because I think sometimes that's that's the crux of the conversation. And I love my siblings who are queer and Muslim from the Caribbean, and have honestly shared their experiences of prejudice, right, amongst my community members. I think it's tough, right? Like I remember, so many of I'll pause there, right? Like one, there is a thriving, beautiful Black communities across the country for a very long time. I would say, at least since the 16th, 17th century. And yeah, we need to come to the table, the proverbial table, and have honest conversations about how we can embrace and celebrate and honor our differences amongst Muslims, right? I think the one ummah idea is beautiful, but I think, what would it look like to acknowledge our differences and celebrate them? And we said, don't make people feel like shit. Like that's not, that's not cool or great. Sorry, doctor.
I use that word on occasion.
Okay, good. Okay.
If you guys don't mind, I'm going to respond to this question from anonymous attendee. A lot of Islamic practices can often be quite gender binary. How can we engage with these practices while honoring gender fluidity? I think, first of all, I just want to say that I had the opportunity through a generous grant from the Arcus Foundation to actually spend 3 years going to classical Islamic sources, especially looking for a relationship between the Quranic passage, Laqad karamna bani Adam. I gave honor, karama, to all of the descendants of the first person who was named Adam. Of course, I focused first on my own areas of specialty, which is the Quran and the discourse about the Quran called tafsir. But then I went on to do hadith and sirah, so the statements and the life of the Prophet, upon him be peace. And I ended in the area of what's called fiqh or jurisprudence, sometimes mistakenly called Sharia, which is the sacred way, the way of oneness and the way of wholeness. And I was very surprised that in the first 500 years of Islamic discourses about the matter that I was, researching, that there was such a strong effort for inclusion. They have a person, we know about the two-spirit and, other, binary personalities as recognized or sometimes refuted by different cultures. But they had what was called the mukhannith and the khunta. Now, there's a slight difference between these two, but it kind of relates to our sense of non-binary, because it's either a person who is not affirming the bodily identification in which they're born, as in cisgendered, But they were not always people who necessarily were going to make a bodily transition, which, by the way, has been approved in so many aspects of Islamic law. So, trans is already a part, no matter what pushback you hear. But in any case, I just want to make this category as broad as I understood it. And what they did is, even though they maintain a gender segregation, say, for example, for the lineup for prayer, usually with men in the front, we know about that, women in the back, we know about that, is that they designated a space in the middle until and if the persons in that, non-binary location turns to identify with one gender or the other. This is classical Islam. This is 500 years. I purposely only studied the first 500 years rather than the next 500 and then the 500 that we are currently at the end of, because I wanted to know what was the original discourse. So actually, this kind of homophobic articulations of Islam are very new. They belong to the transformation after the period of colonialism. And colonialism brought its own puritanical notions, which Muslims imbibed, and then they push them back out and then pretend that the source is Islam. But actually, if you look at Islamic sources from so early, that's not the case. So bringing us to the present, sorry, I had to give this long-winded background, but bringing us to the present, there are a couple of very specific things I want to recommend. And one is, if you build it, they will come. Be sure to create your own spaces, no matter how small and no matter for what duration. So it could be that you just want to get together, once a week or once a month or something like that. And the purpose of that space is an affirmation of the full depth of your identity in the presence of others, while you also maintain your allegiance to, that one which created us and created us exactly as she wished for us to be. So you want to not wait for them to make you feel whole. You want to start out whole and then reach out to others who will embrace that. But there are also already spaces that are created. I do recommend that you not only participate and support those kinds of spaces, those kinds of organizations, those kinds of initiatives, but you push back for any element that they have. I mean, if they don't have wheelchair accessible spaces, for example, it means that they're already marginalizing other persons who might not be interested. So be a part of the transformation of those spaces, because in my experience, what they're really trying to do is be as open as possible, given all the constraints that we already have. But sometimes there's a lapse. Sometimes they don't really smell out the anti-Black racism, and you want to call them on it. So create the spaces, participate in the spaces, push back in those spaces. Communal worship cannot be duplicated in isolation. There is such a thing as khalwa, or sacred, participation by yourself, but there's also what they call suhba, in the company of people. But sometimes you can't go into the spaces that already exist that are pushing back. So you want to find those spaces that are trying to embrace, and you want to create those spaces. So sorry, sometimes I have to wear my Auntie Diva professor hat. There's one last question, and that is from the Queer Muslims of Boston. Do you have any advice for queer Muslims who've left Islam because of queer phobia? How do you think they can be brought? They say brought back. I'm just gonna edit it. How can they be brought back to an Islam that embraces them, and therefore reminding them that there are many Islams? And that will be our final question. I hope everybody has a chance to respond.
Yes, there are some things that come to mind. I think film is a beautiful way. I mean, I work in documentary now and public media. And one of the things that I lead is creating community screenings. And Al-Nisa is a great, beautiful film that you could have to bring people together to talk about issues. It's so important to be in community, to have conversations. I mean, it's great. We could Google something and look it up and write it down, but to engage with different ideas and different perspectives, I mean, that is invaluable. So I think bringing people together with art is incredible. And film is a medium that brings all these different art forms in it. And it has a bit of a distance where it doesn't feel, even when people are sharing their personal stories, there's still some distance where people feel like they can engage with the work. So that could be a way to bring people together, and not shaming folks. I mean, asking questions, unlearning. I mean, there's so much. When I came into Islam, I was like, oh my gosh, there's so much to learn. And I think what brought me back to even identifying and not shying away from saying, yes, I'm Muslim, even when you think the Muslim police is going to come running and say, like, did you say your salats and make your salats, you know? Know about that. But what made me feel like I come back to Islam is feeling like I don't have to fit into this box, and being in places where you don't feel shame. You got to find your people and let people know that you're interested, you know, asking questions and building community. And like I said, utilizing art, those are some amazing tools. But yeah, find your people there. We're out here. We outside, you know, we out here again. So
Thank you so much. I want to give Lali and Red a chance to respond and also keep my eye on the time. Thank you so much. Friends.
Yeah, I'll jump in and just co-sign using Beyonce's internet to like, we're in the information age. I think it is a lot easier now to find people with, you know, like minds for whatever it is. I know that if I want to find people who love collecting elephants, I can find those people, right? I'm looking over at my elephant collection, right? I can totally find those people wherever they are. And as odd as it sounds, like starting where you can is always helpful. Like, we sometimes, when we're focused on the ideal of what it could be, like, we overlook what the steps would be to get to that place, right? I would love to be able to go to an affirming mosque, right? Until then, I can find my beloved community in all the ways that I can. I concur that being on this panel, like, I am hoping to extend my friend pool, right? And my community of people that I can go to and share commonality with in this space, right? And I'm looking very much forward to be able to do that. I'm sure that all of us are on some platform that we can connect with each other. And those of you all who are watching on Zoom and you know, joining us on the platform, you can also like do that same thing and connect with us, and we can connect with each other, and we can keep that going. And so it's something that is exciting to me, and I hope that I share that with all of you.
It is so exciting. I love art. I love Googling. For me, you know, I love, and I'm going to borrow Laverne Cox's terminology. I would encourage all of us, you know, if you can, and if safety, you know, like allows you to be a possibility model. You know, talk about how much you love the Dean out loud. You know, commune and convene with your folks out in public. You know, like for me, because I think the question is about, right, like how, if somebody has left because of queer phobia, right? Like, I think coming back isn't a difficult or hard project if they can see people outside living and loving and being one with the deen. I think be a possibility model. Talk about how you have reconciled your queerness and your Islam. For some of us, reconciliation doesn't have to take place. We just, we always knew. But if you reconciled it and if there was a process, talk about it, right? I think it will inspire other people to reflect, focus, refocus, refocus. I think, yeah, I think for me at least, right? Like that is what would be inspiring, to see other people doing the damn thing. And yeah, thanks to everybody today for this beautiful conversation.
Yes, as I mentioned earlier, self-representation is such an important part of the movement that is part of our current generation. Many of us came, into these identities, and as I said, we looked around and we didn't see anybody else, so we kind of thought that we were, wrong. So that's why, I'm really appreciative of each of you that are on this panel in terms of your thoughtful and transparent sharing, also making it available for others who might see this at some, other time and place, to recognize, that we're here and we're queer, and that, our love for Islam is not going to be restricted by those people whose perspective of Islam is one of hate. And at the same time, because of our non-white identity, we are not, and I mean, I want to say Black, but the reality is I am Black. I'm also wearing the t-shirt because in Asia, where I live, I have to kind of overdo the Blackness. I literally did a workshop in the Horn of Africa last month and had a South Sudanese participant tell me that I am not Black. And I'm like, I don't know, because, when my father took me to the March on Washington when I was just 10 years old with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., my path was already set. And that was, as 60 years ago. So, I think that the work that I do is very consistent with regard to being anti-white supremacy, calling out people. And at the same time, because queer Islam is in fact a global reality, there are different identities and ethnicities that are at work in it. And owning our own Black identity is an important part of self-representation, but it's not all that we are. And also because, to be frank, the Black Muslim community in the United States is one of the most conservative communities. And therefore, there's a certain level of resistance just in trying to own our Blackness with others in Islam, and at the same time having to deal with that pushback. I am the founder of Queer Islamic Studies and Theology, which is an online platform for the promotion of the return to an inclusive study of sexualities as part of the study of Islam. Anyone is free to join. You do have to subscribe because of the security for those who are already in it. I'm also on platforms as the Lady Imam. I have a YouTube channel, a Patreon page. I used to have Instagram, but they booted me out. I think the conservatives got a hold of it. But I'm also on Twitter. So please feel free, to engage in the work that I do. I have an amazing assistant who helps to keep that work out there. For the rest of us, if you want to identify the ways in which your social media is accessible to people, we got a minute to do that before Jennifer needs to close the session.
I'm Red Summer, or Another Red Summer, on all the platforms.
I'm Asadullah Saeed on all the platforms, ASADULLAHSAED.
And I'm at Queer Qabil. Qabil is QABIL. I also just want to encourage anybody who's looking for pamphlets for family members. If you go to salamcanada.org, org.ca.com. They all go to the same place. We published last year, before we shut down after 30 incredible years, 5 pamphlets for queer people in your life. And there's one pamphlet dedicated to parents of LGBTQ children. They will save a life. So please share them far and wide. You can print them and everything.
And I'm hoping that the next time we meet, that will be even further proliferations of the love that we share amongst ourselves. I love you all. Thank you so much for allowing me to moderate. I hope I did justice to each of you. And I will turn over to Jennifer, because I am like, trying to pretend I can monitor the chat, the Q&A, and the time zone. So Jennifer, you have it for us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I am overwhelmed with gratitude, and I thank each of you. I thank God for this time. I thank all who have been a part of bringing us together again, and most especially to you, Dr. Amina Wadud, for your moderation and for your comments, Red Summer, and thank you for the fullness of your naming even in this space. Thank you for you and all of you, and for bringing all of you to this space. Thank you. Thank you so much, Lali Mohamed, and thank you so very much, Asadullah Muhammad. Thank you so much for being here. I'm grateful, and I am posting some information so that you know that we are not done yet. This is this is part 3 of 4 parts, but it's clear that what has begun here will be continuing on, and there is a poster that that can also be shared at this time to let you know that we'll be back together on March 16th. At 3 p.m. I thank you so much for joining us at this hour so that we could be together in different time zones today. And even with this time that is so late for some of us, it's so early for you, Dr. Wadud. And so I'm so grateful for all of the sacrifices that each of you have made and that attendees have made to be here. And so please join us for the next conversation on March 16th at 3 p.m. Where we will be hearing from guests and the panel and the moderator on Black, queer, Afro-Indigenous, and new religious movements. Also, want you to check out the other iterations in the series. You can find the recordings for the series on the Gender Studies YouTube, the Queen's Gender Studies YouTube channel. Also, please check out the Black Studies podcast, and there's a lot of good conversation there. And look out for the future of this work, because it is our hope that we will be able to publish this in various iterations, but especially to publish the collected volume of these from different traditions, and also to bring us together from different traditions where we can be gathered and continue the love that we have cultivated and share. And indeed, my love to each of you, my gratitude to each of you, and blessings on your evening.